Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today we're tackling college admissions tests
Yeah.
and how to make them fair, especially for students from underrepresented backgrounds.
Right.
Now, whether you're prepping for some kind of debate, writing a paper, or just a total college admissions geek like myself, this deep dive is going to take us way beyond the usual, for or against testing kind of stuff.
Definitely.
We're going deep into some academic research that'll really make you think.
Oh, yeah. It challenges a lot of the common assumptions out there.
Okay, so let me get this straight.
Sure.
There's this whole debate raging about bias in these tests, right?
Huge debate.
It's like some experts are saying predictive bias, that's a myth.
Right.
And others are like, no way, it's a massive problem.
Yeah, and it gets pretty heated sometimes.
And get this, the research we're diving into is smack dab in the middle of that fight.
Oh, yeah.
It's directly taking on a previous study that kind of downplayed the whole bias thing.
It's pushing back for sure.
I'm already intrigued.
It's good stuff.
So instead of getting stuck in this does it exist or not loop, this study asks, why might bias exist and in what ways?
Exactly. It's a much deeper question.
I love that.
Yeah. It gets to the root of the problem.
So what kinds of bias did they find?
Well, they break it down into two main types.
Okay.
Slope-based bias and intercept-based bias.
Oh, okay. Those sound a little jargony.
I know.
For those of us who aren't, stats wizards,
Right.
break it down. What do they actually mean?
Okay, so imagine two runners in a race, right?
Okay.
One gets a head start, even if they run at the same speed. That's kind of like intercept bias.
They see?
Even if tests are equally predictive, like the slopes are the same, historical inequalities can build bias right into that starting line.
Wow.
So a student from an underrepresented group might score the same as a student from a more privileged background,
Right.
but the system could still predict lower success for the first student.
That's messed up.
Yeah, it highlights how unfairness can be baked in from the start.
Makes sense.
Okay.
So what about that other type of bias, the slope thing?
Right. So slope-based bias is all about how steep that line climbs.
Yeah.
It's about how much your test score predicts your college GPA.
Gotcha.
In a perfectly fair system, that slope would be the same for everyone, regardless of background.
Right.
But the study found evidence that that's not always the case.
Interesting.
For some groups, their test scores might not be as strong a predictor of their actual performance in college.
So they're being underestimated.
Exactly. Their potential is hidden by a flatter slope.
Got it. Okay, so we have these two types of bias, intercept and slope,
Right.
both potentially putting certain students at a disadvantage.
Unfortunately, yeah.
So what's causing these biases in the first place?
That's where this research gets really juicy.
Okay, lay it on me.
They use this huge data set from the College Board, hundreds of thousands of students across tons of universities.
Wow.
And they looked at both Black-white and Latinx-white comparisons. And get this, they found evidence for both types of bias in nearly every institution they looked at.
Hold on, both types in almost all the universities.
Yeah, it's pretty widespread.
That's kind of alarming.
It is. It really makes you question the whole system. It definitely should.
So it's not just saying, hey, bias exists.
Yep.
It's showing us how pervasive it is.
Exactly, and pushing us to go beyond just identifying the problem.
Right.
And actually start doing something about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's get into that. What does this study tell us about what universities can actually do to tackle these biases and make testing fair?
Well, it starts with acknowledging that standardized tests have limitations.
Okay.
We can't just rely on them as the only measure of a student's potential.
Right.
Remember those omitted variables we talked about?
Yeah.
All those things that contribute to success but aren't captured by a test score?
Right.
Universities need to take those into account way more seriously.
I never really thought about how a student's mindset, like whether they believe good scores really matter, could actually affect their scores.
It can. It's fascinating.
It is, and it shows how much context matters.
Yeah.
Universities could put more weight on things like the quality of a student's high school,
Right.
their socioeconomic background, the challenges they've overcome,
Absolutely.
their essays, recommendations,
Yeah.
all those pieces that paint a bigger picture.
It's about understanding their journey, not just judging them on one data point.
Exactly.
Uh.
But what about those potential biases in grading that the study found? How can universities make sure that GPAs are a fair reflection of achievement across different groups?
Transparency is key.
Okay.
Clear grading rubrics, faculty training on recognizing and mitigating bias,
I see.
and maybe even exploring different ways to assess students that go beyond traditional letter grades.
Ooh. I like that thinking outside the box.
Yeah, for sure.
Seems like this study is pushing us to rethink the whole system,
It is.
from how we test students to how we prepare them for success.
That's a big challenge.
We've talked a lot about slope-based bias, but what about intercept-based bias?
Mm-hmm.
How can universities address that historical disadvantage that's built into the starting point for so many students?
That's where those DEI initiatives come in.
Yeah.
You know, those special programs for underrepresented students.
Right.
They can play a huge role.
Got it.
But maybe the focus needs to shift a bit.
How so?
Instead of just trying to boost test scores,
Yeah.
maybe the goal should be to level the playing field in terms of those omitted variables.
So providing more access to quality education early on, addressing inequalities in high schools,
Exactly.
creating support systems that help students from all backgrounds thrive.
Yeah, investing in equity from the ground up rather than trying to fix things at the very end with a single test.
Makes sense.
Okay.
So we're starting to get a picture of what universities can do to tackle these biases and create a more equitable admissions process.
Yeah, it's a multifaceted problem.
But what about those cultural frames of reference that we touched on?
Ro-
How can we make sure that the tests themselves aren't biased against students from different cultural backgrounds?
That's a huge piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
And part of the answer lies in diversifying the test development process itself.
You mean having people from different backgrounds with different perspectives involved in creating the tests?
Absolutely. And it's not just who's creating the tests, but also how they're administered.
Okay.
We need to think about things like language accessibility.
Right, especially for students whose first language isn't English.
Exactly. Offering tests in multiple languages, providing accommodations, exploring different assessment methods that aren't so reliant on language.
This is starting to sound like a pretty big overhaul of the whole admissions system.
It is a big shift.
Are we talking about getting rid of standardized tests altogether?
Not necessarily,
Okay.
but we are talking about recognizing their limitations, using them more thoughtfully,
Right.
and supplementing them with a much wider range of information about each applicant. It's about moving from this narrow focus on test scores to a more holistic view of the whole student.
It sounds like a tall order, but also a really exciting opportunity to create a system that's truly fair.
It is. It's a big challenge, but also a huge opportunity.
So where do we go from here? What's the first step?
The first step is recognizing that this is an ongoing conversation,
Right.
and there's no easy fix.
For sure.
It's going to take time, effort, and a willingness to constantly reassess and adjust our approaches.
I hear that.
Mhm.
But the good news is that universities are starting to have these conversations
They are.
and to experiment with new approaches.
Yeah, there's a lot of innovation happening, which is
Yeah.
exciting. And that's where this research is so helpful.
Yeah, I'm with you.
It's not about pointing fingers and saying you're doing it wrong.
Right.
It's giving universities like a framework, a toolbox.
Ooh, I like that. A toolbox for equity.
Right.
So let's dive into that toolbox. What are some of the most useful tools or strategies?
Okay, well, one powerful tool is simply broadening what we mean by merit. For so long, we've just equated merit with test scores.
Right.
And that's way too narrow.
It's like we're judging a fish by how well it climbs the tree.
Exactly. And there are all these other factors, all those omitted variables that really matter.
Yeah.
Things like resilience, creativity, leadership, community engagement.
Right.
These are all parts of merit that deserve to be recognized in admissions.
So how can universities actually do that? How can they shift from just test scores to a more holistic view?
One concrete step is implementing something called holistic review.
Okay, I've heard that term before.
Yeah, it means looking at the whole application package.
Not just the grades and test scores.
Right, but everything, the essays, recommendations, the context.
So if you were on an admissions committee using holistic review, what would you be looking for?
Good question. I'd be looking for signs of passion, curiosity, commitment to learning.
I like that.
I'd want to see how they've engaged with their community, what challenges they've overcome.
So it's about getting to know the person behind the application
Right, seeing them as an individual, not just a set of numbers.
and recognizing that some students have faced bigger obstacles than others.
Absolutely. Like a student from an under-resourced high school might not have had the same opportunities as someone from a fancy prep school.
That's a really important point. So holistic review is one tool.
Yeah.
What else?
Another strategy is rethinking how much weight we give to those tests.
Okay.
Some universities are going test optional or even test blind.
Wait, test blind meaning they don't even look at the scores at all.
Exactly. It's a bold move.
It is.
It has its critics, but it forces universities to look more closely at those other measures of merit.
I see. And is it working?
Early evidence suggests it can lead to a more diverse and successful student body.
That's interesting. I'm curious, have you ever personally experienced bias in your own education?
You know, it's funny you should ask that. I remember this one time in college.
Oh, tell me.
I was convinced my professor graded my paper harshly because of my background.
Really?
Yeah, so I went and talked to him about it.
Oh, break.
It was a good conversation. He admitted that unconscious bias can happen in grading,
That's huge.
and he shared what he was doing to try and prevent it.
I love that he was open to that conversation.
Me too. It really opened my eyes to how widespread this problem can be.
It's not just about policies, then it's about changing mindsets too.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important strategy, faculty training.
Okay.
Universities need to give faculty the tools to recognize and address their own biases.
Both in teaching and in admissions.
Yes, in everything.
So things like workshops on implicit bias,
Right.
discussions about equitable teaching.
It's not just raising awareness, though.
Oh,
It's about giving them practical strategies to create more inclusive classrooms and admissions processes.
Okay, so we've got holistic review, rethinking the role of tests, and faculty training. Anything else in that equity toolbox?
Well, remember those cultural frames of reference?
Yeah, those were fascinating.
Addressing those means really looking at the tests themselves.
Right, making sure they're not biased against certain cultures.
Exactly. This could mean getting more diverse voices involved in developing the tests.
I see.
Maybe offering tests in multiple languages, providing accommodations for students who need them,
Those are good ideas.
and even exploring totally different assessment methods.
Wow, so it sounds like there's no one-size-fits-all solution here.
Nope. It's about using a mix of strategies and adapting them to each university.
And recognizing that this is a journey, not a destination.
You got it. There's no quick fix. It takes time, collaboration, and a willingness to learn and adapt.
So for anyone listening who's involved in college admissions, what's the most important takeaway from all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway is this. Fairness in college admissions isn't just about tweaking a few policies or adding a few points to a score.
It's bigger than that.
It's about fundamentally changing how we define merit, how we assess potential, and how we create opportunities for every student to succeed.
It's about challenging the status quo and building a system that values diversity, equity, and inclusion.
That's it in a nutshell.
I love that. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm wondering, what are some of the biggest challenges that universities face in making these changes?
That's a great question. It's important to be realistic about the roadblocks. Yeah, there are some big ones.
Like, what are the things that could really get in the way of making admissions truly fair?
Well, I think one of the toughest challenges is pushback from folks who benefit from the system as it is.
You mean people who feel like they might lose out if the playing field is leveled?
Exactly. There's this strong belief in a meritocracy, you know.
The idea that those who are successful earned it, and anyone trying to change the system is being unfair.
Right. But as we've talked about, the system itself is already unfair.
Yeah, it favors those who have had more advantages and opportunities.
Exactly. But that can be hard for people to accept, especially those who have always been seen as the winners.
But how do you even start to change those deeply held beliefs?
It's tough. It requires a real cultural shift, not just policy changes.
Right? It's about challenging those assumptions and having hard conversations about privilege and inequality.
And that's never easy.
Definitely not. But besides that cultural resistance, are there other practical challenges that universities face?
Resources are a big one. Implementing something like holistic review takes a lot of time and effort.
Yeah, it needs trained staff who can really dive into each application.
Exactly. And faculty training, developing better tests, all those strategies we talked about, they cost money.
And not every university has the same budget.
Right. Smaller institutions might struggle to do this alone.
So it sounds like this is where outside help could make a difference.
Totally. There are foundations, nonprofits, and government agencies that support equity in education.
Okay.
They can provide funding resources, expertise to help universities make these changes.
That's good to hear because the stakes are high, right?
They are. We're talking about creating a system where everyone has an equal shot.
Exactly. And it's not just about being fair.
Right.
It's about tapping into all the talent that's out there.
That's a great way to put it. If we're only admitting students based on test scores, we're missing out on so much potential.
Right. All those amazing fish who just can't climb trees.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A more equitable admissions process isn't just the right thing to do.
That's the smart thing, too.
Exactly. We get a richer, more diverse,
Right.
and ultimately more successful group of students.
That's a powerful message.
Hmm.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah,
I'm feeling hopeful, but also a sense of urgency.
I get that.
Hopeful because universities can take concrete steps to make a real difference.
Right.
And urgent, because we need to act now.
I agree completely. This isn't just a theoretical discussion. It's a call to action for anyone who cares about a fairer future.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with that thought.
That's good.
We'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences on this issue too, so please share them.
Yes, join the conversation.
Until next time, keep diving deep.